OutsideIn is a series that was initiated at NCBS by Professor Sadamani. And we have been happy to support this initiative from the communications office. And we've had many exciting discussions, which I would encourage you to check out on our Blisk YouTube channel. And for now, I'm very excited to welcome you to a session with Professor Rohini Balakrishnan, who is a bioacoustics expert, and she's a senior professor at the Indian Institute of Science. So her team works on different aspects of animal communication and bioacoustics. So their research spans the areas of bioacoustics, animal behavior, community and habitat ecology, and systematics. So their work combines both theoretical, experimental, sorry, not both, but all theoretical, experimental, and observational approaches. So often it involves both lab and field studies. Uh, n- Although she is known for her work on crickets, her lab also works on birds, bats, and elephants. And a recent and exciting uh, acknowledgement of her long-term career studying crickets is the naming of a new species of Mexican tree cricket, which has been named Ecanthus rohine after her. So without further ado, I hand it over to Professor Rohini Balakrishnan, and I'd like to thank you for joining us and talking about your work today.
So thank you very much. And I'd like to thank the Bangalore Life Science Cluster for inviting me to give this talk. I'm very excited to give it. And thank you so much, all of you who've logged in to watch this today. So let me share my screen. I hope all of you can see this. Yes, great. So today I'm going to share with you some small but very exciting part of some of the work that we've been doing for many years now on acoustic communication. I don't seem to be able to move my slides. Sorry, let me just go back. Sorry about that. Yeah. Right. So I've spent most of my time working on crickets, and just to sort of ground you on where these insects belong. Crickets belong to the insect order of Orthoptera, and they have two major suborders, which are the crickets or the Ensiphera and the grasshoppers or the Calyphera. So you can see a grasshopper over here, and the rest of these are all crickets. The crickets produce sounds, and they produce sounds by actually rubbing their wings together. Can people see my arrowhead, my pointer?
Yes, we can.
Yes, thank you. Crickets also have ears on their forelegs, which I will show you. They differ from grasshoppers who can sing. Grasshoppers typically sing by moving the leg against the wing, whereas crickets move their wings together. So their sound production mechanisms are different. And grasshopper ears are actually on the abdomen. So next time, if you see one of these insects and you don't know whether it is a cricket or a grasshopper, this is how you can tell them apart. The positions of the ears are different, and also grasshoppers have short antennae and crickets have very long antennae. So that's how you would tell them apart in the field. So my talk's going to be on crickets, and the crickets themselves sort of divide into three major groups. There's the Grilloidea or the true crickets. These are the little black-brown guys that you see in the ground and in the lawns. In the fields, you can hear them chirping, be it in urban or suburban, rural settings as well. And then there are the katydids or the tetygonids. They are another large group of crickets. So these two animals that you see here are the katydids or tetygonids. I'll be using this interchangeably. And as you can see, katydids can often be green and leaf-like, or they can be brown. But their body is quite different. As you can see, the crickets look more like cockroaches. They are dorsoventrally flattened, whereas the katydids, as you can see, their wings are sort of elongated and laterally flattened, right? And then there's this other very large crickets. It's a group of very interesting crickets, the Grylacridoids. These are ancient crickets, and they're interesting because they are really giant. They're among the largest insects known. They're known as waiter, mostly found in New Zealand and Australia, but we have a few members in South India, and we were very excited to have discovered one of these some years ago. But today's talk is going to focus mostly on these. To give you a little bit of background, how do crickets actually produce sound? They lift their forewings and rub them together. And the reason that this produces sound, as you can see here in this picture of the forewing, the first thing you will notice is that there are very few veins across this wing, which is not typical for an insect wing. You would normally have a lot of veins across it. And on the underside of this vein, if you look, there's a row of pegs, and this electron microscope image shows you this beautiful set of pegs. And there's also a little plectrum on the margin of the wing. It's just like the plectrum of a guitar. And the wings are symmetric in true crickets. And basically, when the insect rubs the wings together, the plectrum of one wing, rubs against this file, and it's a little bit like a knife rubbing against a comb, and that's the primary sound that's produced. So when you, each time the cricket closes its wings, you get sound because this plectrum rubs against the row of pegs on the file of the other wing. And then that sound actually is amplified as well as changed around by these two resonant structures, the harp and the mirror, and that's what determines what the final sound that comes out looks like. So with this fundamental mechanism, crickets can produce an enormous diversity of sounds, and I will play some of them to you as we go along. No point producing sounds if you can't hear them. So I just want to point out to you the ear of a cricket. It's on the first pair of legs. So there's one pair of ears, and they have an eardrum strung out over here. Eardrums very similar to our eardrums, and that's what they use to hear sounds. Why do crickets produce sounds? Cricket sounds are produced by adult males who are trying to attract females for mating. How can you tell this is a female? A female has an ovipositor at the back, which allows her to lay eggs. Males lack this. And also in most true crickets, only males have the apparatus to make sound. Females don't have that, they're silent. But they can hear sounds and they can home in on them. As you can see in this very nice painting, which was made in the 1700s, this fact has been known for a very, very long time, that male crickets standing here, singing at the mouth of a burrow, and a female coming in towards him. How can we test this? We can test this if we make a recording of the song of a cricket, play it out through a loudspeaker in the field. You can see from this loudspeaker that these experiments were done very long ago. They were done in the 1930s and 40s, largely in France. And what you can see is that if you play out the song, you can attract female crickets of a particular species. So what this tells you is that these songs are sufficient to attract females, and the females that come in are of the same species as the male. So each species of cricket actually has its own unique call. But communication poses problems. So if we have a sender, in this case, the male cricket, he puts out his song or signal. This has to be put out into the public medium, right? All of us can hear the crickets sing. Although his message is really to the female of his own species, the message has to be put out in a public medium. And there are all kinds of issues there. And I must digress here to tell you that the problems that you have, crickets have or frogs have in doing this kind of communication is exactly the same kinds of problems that humans face when they try to communicate. And the best analogy I can think of is your cell phone networks. Because you want to send a message to a particular person, and you want that message to be a private message, but you have no choice but to put that signal out into a public medium. And that can create all kinds of problems because the medium can distort your signal. Also, if many senders, all of us are sending our messages together or trying to call together. So there's a lot of competing callers. This can result in all kinds of interference. So think about it. Hundreds of people are putting out their signals all together into the atmosphere. It's all mixing up over there. And yet the receiver at the end, which in your case is your cell phone of the receiver, has to pick up one specific message among so many others. And what are the strategies, right? Engineers use certain strategies to make sure that we can do this and that we can unscramble these distorted messages. Exactly the same thing in natural communication networks. Many species of crickets are all calling together. Each wants to send a message only to females of his own species, but all of them have to put their messages out together. And so you get a cacophony of sound, which is what you will hear as the sun goes down, whether you're in an urban setting or you're in a rural setting or you are in a forest. And these signals can also be picked up by unwanted receivers who can eavesdrop. For humans, these would be spies, for example, who try to, tap in on phone conversations. For crickets, it's bats, right? They might hear these signals and home in on them. So there is a risk. You have to put out your call so you can get a mate, a female to approach you so you can get a mate. But that call can also be exploited by somebody who has bad intentions towards you, in this case, to eat you. So there's huge parallels actually between communication networks, natural communication networks, and our artificial communication networks. And that's one of the reasons I'm really interested in this. And we have been studying this communication network, which I won't talk about today, in the rainforests of KUDREMUKH National Park. And we have done that for the past 15 years or more. But today's talk is going to focus mostly on this interaction, the unwanted receivers. So to tell you where this work has been done and to ground you, we have worked in and around KUDREMUKH National Park in the Western Ghats. It's due west of Bangalore over here. And this is what KUDREMUKH National Park looks like. It's in the Western Ghats, it's mountainous, it's steep, it's rainforest. And when we started out 20 years ago, it seemed like this was going to be very, very hard to do. It was very, very hard. But one of my first PhD students was one of these completely intrepid people who went out into these forests and actually managed to track down and record the calls of almost all of the species of crickets that inhabited patches of these rainforests. And I'm just going to play you a few of these calls. So this is a canopy katydid. It's called a false leaf, as you can see, false leaf because its wings look exactly like a leaf. Both of these are false leaf katydids. Let me play you the call of this one. It's a almost bird-like call. Here's a true cricket from the understory. I hope you can hear the sound. Another. This is very high frequency, false leaf. This is Mycopoda, who lives in the ground in the leaf litter. And this animal has spread far out of the rainforest. And I'm sure many of you may have heard this. Very harsh, rough sounding call. And remember that all of these very different calls are being produced by that same single fundamental type that I spoke about. And here's our very exciting find, the waiter. You'll hear some background calls and then you'll hear some crack, crack, crack calls, and that's the waiter. Yeah. The click, click calls are the waiter. They're also in the canopy. Okay, that's just to give you a feel for what some of these calls are like. And of course, these calls might invite bat predators, not just females. So, I'll cycle through these. I hope I can change my slide. Yeah. So we wondered who their predators were, and having figured out who the insect community was, my postdoc Raghuram went and spent a couple of years in KUDREMUKH National Park misnetting bats, since we do know that bats are major predators of katydids. And here's the set of bats that we came up with, that we trapped in our mist nets after 2 years of trapping. As you can see, we have a list of about 20 species. The first 4 of these are fruit bats. And again, these are probably quite familiar to you, from the pteropus or the giant flying foxes to other kinds of fruit-eating bats. So these 4 were not likely to be predators of our crickets and katydids, but we have a number of other contenders. Some of them, like the pipistrelles, are very, very tiny and would not tackle things the size of a cricket or katydid. Some of them were extremely rare. We only got like 1 or 2 captures in 2 years. And some of them, we went in and look at their roosts and see what they're eating, the rhinolophids. They eat mostly lepidopterans, that's moths. So really, we were left with the megadermatids, Megaderma lyra, Megaderma spasma. These are called false vampire bats. These are the ones at the bottom over here. They're called false vampires because they look like vampires. They're not vampire bats. And we finally homed in after a process of elimination on who our main cricket predator was. Megaderma spasma. This is the lesser false vampire bat. It's a nice name. It's a small bat with a long name. It's not as small as the pipistrelles, but it's still a pretty small bat. You can hold it in the palm of your hand. And although they do live in the rainforest, they have adapted to coming and living in villages. And in and around KUDREMUKH National Park, a lot of houses actually have these bats in, they grow areca there. So in areca go downs or in abandoned houses. So it's convenient because there are large numbers of roosts of these. If you go into one of these roost sites and you look at the floor, this is what you will see. You'll see a lot of discarded insect remains. And these green things are all katydid wings. What it tells you is that these bats are actually eating large numbers of katydids, in addition to things like cicadas and moths. So these culled remains, as we call them. So why are they discarded here? Occasionally bats will bring prey back to their roosts. And obviously there's no point in eating the wings and the spiky legs. So they bite them off before they eat the insect. And that gives us a sort of treasure trove if you sort of do the very simple thing of visiting these roosts, say once a week, and just collecting up all these culled remains and looking at them. And you're a good entomologist, you can actually figure out what these bats are eating. And that's what my postdoc Raghu did. And what you see on the left here is a result of simply analyzing these remains. And we asked what orders of insects are being eaten. And you can see that the reds are eaten in very large numbers. These are from 5 different roosts shown here, followed over a year. And the Orthoptera are eaten in very large numbers, anything from 80% to about 40%, large part of the diet. They also do eat a lot of things like moths and cicadas, but Orthoptera do contribute a large part of their diet. And among the Orthoptera, 98% were from the katydids, very few from the true crickets. So most of the orthopteran diet consisted of these tetygonids, which I talked to you about, these larger crickets, which can be green or brown. So yes, these bat predators are eating them in large numbers. But the big sort of shock that came to me, examining these remains, if you can see these little what should I call them, sword-like things over here. These are actually the ovipositors of females. Now, female katydids don't sing, males sing, okay? But we can see here that lots of females are also being eaten, and this intrigued me a lot. And so we asked the question, are male katydids who call preyed upon more heavily than females who are silent? And that's exactly what we expect. That's what the textbooks say. That's what theory says. When we counted these remains, what we found was that if we look at the ratio of ovipositors, which tells us they're females, to the forewings with the stridulatory apparatus, sound producing apparatus, we find the ratio is about 1.8. Okay, so almost twice as many. And again, if you compare female forewings to male forewings in these remains, it's also about 1.8, which means almost twice as many females. So this is just showing you the stridulatory apparatus. So that's how you can tell whether a wing is a male or female. Only males have these structures, females don't have them. So almost twice as many of the remains of these katydids consisted of females, okay, rather than males. And this was intriguing because females don't produce sounds, it's the males who produce sounds. So how come they're getting eaten more? So this observation was so intriguing that I decided I needed to see this with my own eyes. So we decided to try and do a series of behavioral experiments with the bats. So basically we would go out and catch bats. We constructed a large outdoor enclosure and introduced one bat at a time. And in the enclosure, we would also have playback speakers, either just speakers or speakers with katydid tethered above it or placed on the speaker. Let me show you what one of these experiments looks like. I'm going to show you a video. So this is filmed with infrared camera within one of these outdoor enclosures. You can see the two speakers over here, and placed on top of each of these speakers, there is a live immobilized katydid, okay? And there's a bat somewhere in the cage. And what I'm going to do now is to play you the soundtrack of this. So there's a lot of background sound that you will hear, but we do play the call of this katydid, which was a somewhat higher frequency call. So look out for that. This is all background. I will point to this call. I hope you saw the bat. So the bat swooped down on it and it was. We do this kind of experiment. We did it with multiple, the calls of multiple katydid species, the Mycopoda, which I showed you, the false leaf, two false leaf katydids. And if you do this over and over again, what you find, if you look at the proportion of trials in which you get a response, it hovers somewhere between 30 and 40%, irrespective of what kind of call you play. Basically, about 30 to 40% of trials in which you play out these calls, the bat actually does approach. However, if you take a female and tether it, as I showed you above the speaker, and you induce flight. So what you do is you tether a female on a string and suspend her just above the speaker is not playing, and you just blow wind at her, she will start flying. So the moment you induce flight, what you see 100% of the time bats come down. So bats actually are coming down much more often when you induce flight than when you have playback of calls. And this suggests that actually flight is way more dangerous than calling. So flying female katydids are actually, what these experiments tell us, are 2 to 3 times more likely to be captured by bats than calling males, is what it suggests to us. And this is in consonance with what we see in the diet of the bat, which is that female remains are twice as many as male remains. And this was, in some sense, it was a completely counterintuitive finding, because the lore in the field, if you like, is, yes, there's all these loudly calling males. It's males that are taking all the risks and are attracting these bat predators. And yet we see that these silent females are perhaps actually getting eaten more. So then we wondered, if this is what is going on, then does that affect the behavior of these females? Are females, so willing then to fly, if flying is so dangerous? So we decided to look at this in one of these species in detail. And we were finding a lot of remains of the species, which is why we chose this one. This is the false leaf katydid that lives in the canopy. This is the male, which I've shown you here. So we then caught females of the species, brought it into the lab, and tried to run what we call a phonotaxis experiment. So this is our standard experiment we do in the lab when we want to find out whether animals are orienting to sound. So we have a T-shaped structure made of tree branch, and we have speaker at this end. At this end, we play one or the other at a time. And we have a female here at the end of the T. You play out a call. Any normal cricket will either walk up here and get to that speaker or fly to it. Okay, this is what we always expect. So I'm going to show you what this female did. So the female is sitting here at the bottom of the T, as you can see. We've put her on a leaf. I'm going to start the video, and in a little while, you'll start hearing the song, which is coming from a speaker placed here. And let's see what the female does. Look at her carefully and look at the leaf carefully. So we haven't started yet. The sound will start up. Can you see her shaking the leaf? Every time she hears the male call, she shakes that leaf. She's not walking. And she will do this for about 3 minutes. Okay. So we were intrigued by this, and I thought that by shaking this leaf, she may be sending a vibrational signal along the branch to tell the male where she is, rather than walking up to him. So is that true? So the first thing we had to find out is whether there's a signal going out when she shakes the leaf. Now she will get up and go. So what we did was we then repeated this playbacks, but now we had the female on a branch in the lab, played back the sound to her, and she responds by this behavior that you just saw. And then we measured whether there is a vibrational signal going along the branch using a laser vibrometer. So a laser vibrometer basically sends a laser down onto this branch, and it can measure if there is any vibration happening on the surface of this branch. And when you do that, if you look over here, this is a visualization of the male call that you heard in the video. And you can see here that alternating with this male call, the laser vibrometer is picking up this vibrational signal, which coincides with whenever the female makes the tremulation. So yes, there is a tremulation or a vibrational signal going through that branch. And you can sort of quantify the timing relationship between the male call. As you can, if you heard and looked at the video, they were alternating. And what this diagram below shows you is simply a mathematical representation of that. It's a vector diagram. And this is the time of the male chirp. So here we take just one period of the male chirp, going from the onset of this to the onset of this, which is 360 degrees over here. And what you see over here is the time during that period that is used by the male chirp. And somewhere in the rest of it will be where the female gives her answer. And each of these arrows shows you for a different individual female at what point in that silent gap her answer comes in. The fact that all of these vectors almost are going up to this edge of the circle means there's a very, very tight time relationship between when the male makes this call and when the female makes her response. And each individual has a particular specific fixed timing relationship between when she gives her reply to the male's call. So very good. It looks like there is a signal in there, and it's got a very tight timing relationship with the male's call. So it was the first known example in animal communication of a multimodal duet, an acoustic vibratory duet. So acoustic duets are well known in birds and in insects, but this is the first time that we had a duet happening in two different modalities through sound and the reply coming through vibration. But this is just a story unless you can show it to be true. So we had to do behavioral experiments to ask, what does it mean for the male? This is just to show you that the response, this tremulatory response of the female, is specific to the song of this species. So you only get these tremulatory responses if you play the call of this species. If you play the call of another species that lives in the same area, such as this waiter, you don't get such responses. And of course, you don't get them when there is silence. So it's a very specific response. Then we asked, what does it mean for the male? So to do this, we had to do some amount of technology. So we used an electromagnetic actuator to actually mimic the vibratory response of the female in the lab. So we played back these vibratory signals to mimic the female's response to a male call through a natural branch while the song was also playing. So we basically recreated this duet. And we asked whether males would approach these vibratory signals. And in the next slide, I will show you the results of this experiment, which shows you how often males actually chose the arm that was vibrating. And what you can see over here is that in the 9 males that we tested, all of them actually choose the vibratory arm over the non-vibratory arms. And in a number of controls where you play only the sound, that is, the vibrational signal is not there, or there's silence, or you actually have the vibrational signal, but you disconnect the actuator. So basically, you don't have a vibrational signal coming through. These responses of the males don't happen. These are just standard controls to show that this is specific to when you play the vibratory signal. Also, if you play only vibration and don't have sound, then you don't get the response. So this is, again, from the male side, a very specific response to this female's vibrational signal, showing that this is indeed an acoustic vibrational duet, and the male is capable of using the signal to sort of home in on the female. What does this mean? So we discovered a novel multimodal duetting communication system, and the female tremolation response had a fixed timing relationship with respect to the male acoustic signal. The female tremolation response was specific to the call of the species, the male of the species. Males do approach these female tremolation signals, and we showed that in our playback experiments. And this is an interesting piece we can discuss, only if both the acoustic and vibratory components of the duet are present. So I'm going to sum this up. What do we know now about this entire system? We've got katydid species in which the males call using sound to attract females. These sounds can sometimes be exploited by bats, as we showed in our speaker playback experiments. So bats do listen in on these sounds and can home in on calling males and eat them. But both males and females get preyed upon. That's what the diet data tell us. And indeed, the diet data tell us that females are being eaten more than males. And again, our behavioral experiments told us also that flying females are 2 to 3 times at risk of having bats approach them. So flying seems to be more dangerous than calling, which is very counterintuitive. And we believe that possibly in response to the fact that flight is so dangerous for these animals, these females, at least of this one species that we've tested, have evolved this vibrational reply signal rather than immediately trying to orient and fly towards the male. And now the male uses that vibrational signal to then home in on a female within a tree. This last piece of whether there is cause and effect over here is something we are trying to test at the moment, using more behavioral experiments with bats and katydids in flight cages. And my PhD student has just finished a series of experiments, and we have to see what it does, which is whether flying, calling, or vibrating is more dangerous using live bats and live katydids. So I'm going to end here, but I would like to acknowledge all the fantastic students and postdocs who have done all of this work. To start with Swati Divakar, my intrepid first student, who characterized the entire insect acoustic community of KUDREMUKH and discovered many of the species we are talking about today and their calls. And I should tell you that Swati was bitten by a pit viper in her first field season and spent time in the ICU and still decided to come back and complete this very difficult PhD. My postdoc Raghuram, who spent many, many months misnetting in the forests of KUDREMUKH to identify all the bats, as well as looked at the diet, and together with Dhrup and Ritik carried out those fairly challenging playback experiments in the field. My postdoc, Kaveri Bittu Rajaraman, who discovered the multimodal duet and collaborated with Vamsi Goti and Rudra Pratap in the nanoscience department to again measure the vibrational signals and run playbacks with them. And our field assistant, Sudhakar Gowda, without whom we would actually not be able to do any of the field work. I'll stop here and I'll take questions.
Thank you, Professor Rohini. I think, there was a lot to digest here, and I enjoyed learning about it. And
shall I unshare? Or shall I keep the...
Yeah, you can stop. Yeah. And we had a lot of, I think people are quite interested in hearing more about, why is this predation more on females? So one person asked from YouTube, is it because of the number of females in comparison to males, or is that not a factor?
Yeah, that's an absolutely fantastic question, and it's a killer question because it's very, very difficult in the wild to measure the adult sex ratio. We haven't been able to do it for the pseudophilines, the false leaf katydids, but we've been able to do it for one of the other katydid prey species, which is Mycopoda, and there is a more interesting story. So we have carried on with this. So the things I told you about the female bias was across species of katydids. We've now started to look at this, try and look at this species by species, and the stories are slightly different. In the false leaf katydids, the ratio has increased from 2:1 to 4:1 of females. And we don't know whether this is because there is a higher adult sex ratio. These are canopy animals and very difficult to figure out the adult sex ratio. In Mycopoda, what we find is that in one season, the predation is male biased, and in another season, as you go towards the end of the breeding season, it is female biased. So it goes from male biased to female biased, and this is not explained by the sex ratio. So the stories are complicated, and we don't have the data for all of them.
Okay, great. Thank you, and I hope, Sharad, this answers your question. Coming to a question here about flying.
Yeah.
So, sorry, one second. Yeah. So you've mentioned that, the crickets have evolved, right? Possibly in that one species to make a call, right?
A tremulation call. A tremulation. Yeah.
The tremulation. Right. So so the question is, using that is that beneficial? So I think you discussed that it might be an evolutionary thing, but the question is, what is the benefit of using vibratory signals over making calls? So, does it have is it an environmental factor, or do you think other species have also developed this way?
Sure.
Yeah.
So the idea is that tremulatory signals are less detectable than sound signals. And in fact, in work in Costa Rica and Panama on other katydid communities, they have found that in forests where there's very high abundance of bats, males have moved to a mixed acoustic vibratory signal. That is, they don't produce these long acoustic signals for a long time. They produce some acoustic signals and then the rest is tremulatory. So the idea is that tremulation is less detectable by bats, which makes sense. But ours had this very strange result, of course, that we are not now thinking only of calls. We're also thinking of flight. And definitely, I believe that tremulation will be much safer than flying. So if you think about it in a within tree context, so there's a male calling in a tree, and normally a female would fly towards him. That would be really dangerous. But if she now tremulates and sends this vibrational signal, then the business of movement, the onus is now on the male. So he stops calling and he now uses this vibrational signal to walk towards the female, which actually may even be safer for him because he then stops calling. So we think overall there may be huge benefits, anti-predatory benefits of having vibrational signal.
Okay.
I hope that's...
Yes, I think that, yeah, that explains that really well. Thank you. I have a question here. So as you mentioned, it's on within one tree, right? But is there a limit to the distance, that the males can detect this vibration? Have you noticed anything about
that? Yes, we've done a fair bit of work on that. So we started out by trying to measure with a laser vibrometer how far out these signals go. And the laser vibrometer told us 4 meters, because around 4 meters, we can no longer detect signal using a laser vibrometer. But really the question is, how far do the males detect it? So student of mine, Ashwati, did a series of really difficult behavioral experiments to try and figure it out. And the answer is they can detect it up to 8 meters. So the males can detect it up to 8 meters, where the vibrometer simply can't. Okay. And this is almost the record for how far such a vibrational signal can be detected. There's one spider in Costa Rica that can detect vibrational signals up to about 6 or 7 meters. I think this is more or less the record for how far out such a signal can transmit. Yeah.
Okay, that's excellent to hear. They are so sensitive. Uh, and there's a follow-up question from YouTube. So someone is asking about the way that, environmental factors like wind and rain interfere in the signaling. Have you had a chance to explore that?
I mean, not quantitatively, not, we've not measured stuff, but spending many, many years out in the field. So the answer is different for different crickets. But for many, many crickets, if there's a lot of rain, they're going to stop singing. That's for sure. In fact, it's just useless to go out and try and sample on very rainy nights. A light drizzle, yes, they will sing. And just after rain, yes. But heavy rain, most of them just, they don't see the point, I guess, of singing. So yes, definitely rain. And what was the second thing, second factor?
Wind.
Yes, and wind. Especially for the smaller crickets, if it's very windy, they will stop.
Okay.
I don't know about flight because it's very difficult to track flight in the wild.
Yeah, okay, great. So I think that's a fair enough answer for this, because it's hard to study, as we can all imagine.
Yes.
Okay, so coming to some more of our questions here. Someone wants to know if, Tusha asked, if as a cricket, could crickets evolve to produce their chirps during the daytime to avoid predation?
Absolutely. We don't see it very much in the tropics, interestingly, and I'm not very sure why. But many, many temperate crickets, in fact, are daytime callers. So, crickets in Canada and Europe. And we used to sort of, I love the night, but we used to sort of envy our temperate colleagues because they could actually work in the day. I think it has something to do with temperature, because we have warm temperatures throughout, but in temperate regions, maybe nights are really cold. And so many of them have evolved to be daytime callers. But I've not seen it in the tropics very much, except in very dense rainforest. If it's very dark, sometimes you will hear crickets chirping. Rare, very, very rare. But the temperate regions, it's very common.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess.
But is it to avoid predation? I'm not sure. Because, if you don't have nighttime predators, you'll have daytime predators, like birds.
Birds, definitely. So someone has a more personal question. Why were you interested in crickets particularly? So you've worked with other animals also. So what got you started with crickets?
Well, the other animals came after crickets, to be honest. And I think getting started on crickets was, like many things in life, serendipity. So I have a bit of a weird life story, in the sense I always wanted to work on, animal navigation or communication, but I never got opportunities. So I ended up doing the regular bachelor's and master's in zoology, and then ended up doing a PhD in genetics. And at the end of that, I was like, I can't do this anymore. And I have to move out of this. So I tried to make the switch at the postdoc stage to going back to working in animal navigation and communication. And the lab that I was ultimately successful in getting a postdoctoral position in happened to work on crickets. And once I started working on crickets, I was just completely hooked, because I just found so many interesting things about them. Not just the calls, but they're also, they're just the right kind of system, scientifically speaking. You can bring them into the lab, you can do biophysical experiments, you can do neurophysiology if you want, but you can also track them outside in the field. If you work on Drosophila, you can do fantastic lab experiments, but you really can't do anything in the field. If you work on elephants and wild birds, you can do a lot of observation in the field, but it's very, very difficult to bring them in and do anything. These allow you to do everything. I do everything from biophysics to behavioral and evolutionary ecology using the same system. And I think that's a huge, huge advantage for the science, right? And I guess, you start working on something, you get deeper and deeper and more involved sometimes. So even though I went out to do projects on birds and elephants, and I came back to crickets because I felt so much more could be done, and I really enjoyed it much more.
Yeah, so I think everybody has their favorite system to study.
Yes.
So coming to another question, I would ask that Kirti raise their hand so that I can unmute, because I wasn't sure about the question itself, uh, in what context it was asked. So I'll just switch to the next one. Rohan asks, what about the arms, like weapons that bats and crickets have evolved in response to each other's offenses and defenses, and the way that bats and moths have shaped each other. So he
Yes.
means morphological adaptations. So
Morphological. Well, one of the big adaptations, of course, is crickets, like moths, hear ultrasound. And bat echolocation calls are ultrasound. So just like moths, crickets will also avoid ultrasound, especially when they are calling. So that's certainly one defense, and it's much before you encounter the bat. It's a way to get away before a bat can get at you. So crickets do hear ultrasound. Morphological defenses are fewer. There are a few katydid species who are spiny, so it's difficult for any predator to eat them, but that's very rare. Far more often they have adaptations where they just hear them and try to get out of the way. It's not clear that there's there's amputation, which many insects have, of course. So if I get caught by a leg, I just amputate that hind leg, so I get away. Yeah. And bats, okay, so you wanted the counter. Well, bats have a slew of things. One of the things that bats may have counter adapted, as Spasma has, is to make very soft calls. So you don't get heard from very far, which is painful for us when we work on them because it's difficult to pick up their presence. So they're called like silent bats. And by not using echolocation, but listening in on the calls, they have evolved also as a counter strategy.
okay,
Yeah.
I hope that answered his questions.
Also,
Yeah. So coming to another question about why do female katydids fly? Do we have an answer?
why do female katydids fly? They have to fly to find a mate, right? Because more or less males will be sitting in one spot and calling. That's the way it works in this system. Males typically will spend large periods of time calling. So it's like I call from one spot like a beacon, and then the female homes in. She could walk or she could fly. That depends on the distance. But if you're covering a longer distance, you tend to fly. But as you can see, flying is risky.
Right. So, but do they have to cover long distances typically, or are they more or less spaced close?
We don't know too much about these. Again, it depends on the species. If you're on the ground, field crickets, or if your katydid's on the ground, then it can be several meters. But, and we're just studying this right now, in the false leaf katydid that I just spoke about that has the tremulation signal, we know, so there are wheels within wheels over here. So this species focuses only on artocarpus, jackfruit trees. So these males only call from artocarpus trees. And mostly only one male calls from a tree. So we were always very curious, what's going on? Do females fly between trees as well?
Mm.
So if you get what I mean, at some point a female will have to move out of her natal tree, whether it is to disperse, whether it is to find a mate. And just this season, we've been able to put radio transmitters on the insects. This is something we dreamed of doing for 20 years. And it's working. So I can tell you from the preliminary data, both males and females are flying between trees. So.
Okay. That's
Yeah.
awesome to hear, especially about your new
Yes.
experience. Yeah. So Ashish asks, are there any instances where males piggyback on voices made by other males by the call? Um,
Fantastic question. Satellites,
yeah,
right?
yeah, and
So you use the call of one male. We think so. We haven't proven it yet. And in fact, if I go back to the experiment that we did in the lab, which I felt never should have worked, where we played back the call of a male uh, and the female replied to another male,
mm,
and this male actually approached it, we think that represents perhaps in the wild what we would call a satellite strategy, an eavesdropping strategy, but we've not shown that yet. But it is known to exist in other cricket species.
okay, and there was a different question, but related to the same idea. Do the females ever go to the wrong species call, or does that interfere with?
Yes.
Yeah.
So again, the answer depends a lot on which species you're looking at. So in some species, females will almost never go to the wrong call. Um, some species, certain other species who may be very similar, a small proportion of females might approach them. So the answer is it can happen, but the probability of it happening on average is very low. Yeah. Interference, yes. So that's what we worked on for 15 years. So it's a different talk. And again, it depends on who you are. Some species have these very tonal calls. So it's just like one piano key, right? Tone. And the female tunes in. So it's like a radio receiver. And so you don't get too much interference. But there are many species that are very broadband and noisy, like the Mikopura, where the female cannot and does not tune in. And sure, there is interference. So there are all kinds of strategies to deal with interference. That's what we actually worked on for a long time.
Okay. I'm just gonna give Kirti a question, chance to ask the question.
Yeah.
Kirti, please go ahead and unmute yourself if you would like to ask. I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question. It was about the golden number. So go ahead, Kirti. Yeah, we can hear you.
I
I
cannot,
can
but
repeat it.
yeah,
I can.
okay, you can.
So I just wanted to when we talked about the male insect, when
Can't hear her at all.
you
Sorry, I can't hear you.
Why don't you read out the question? Let me see if I can understand it.
So is the 1.8 ratio you mentioned related to
Yes.
the golden number since it is very close and naturally occurring?
What golden number? Oh, you mean would that number fluctuate? Absolutely. And what we've seen now is that when you go down species by species, the numbers can be different. So the 1.8 was across the community, and we've now followed it for another 3 years. It is at least twice as much across the community. But if you start looking at it species by species, for some species, the ratio is 4:1. For some, it is 2:1. For some, it is actually, in some seasons, 1:1.
Okay, I hope that answered the question.
I don't know.
We couldn't hear you, so I hope it did. And then coming maybe to our last question, unless anybody else wants to raise their hand and ask. Um, Someone wants to know, how do you think scientists, ecologists, and academicians should respond to the scenario where there are, forests and other places that are protected now opening up to more human activity?
I think the answer to that is obvious, but how effective all our protests are, yeah, it's an unfortunately losing sort of a losing battle, unfortunately,
Okay,
because
so
everyone thinks it's about development. And what makes me particularly sad is that at the end of a pandemic that has essentially paralyzed the world, yeah, and in which we, now understand that it's really important to give wildlife their space. right? I mean, why are pandemics like this happening? Why are these zoonoses happening? Because there's more and more encounter between humans and wild animals to allow viruses to jump across. And why are these encounters becoming more? In part, it's habitat loss. In part, it's greed and consumption, because there's all these meat markets, right? And the issue of the pandemic in the end is an ecological and evolutionary one, and the solution is an ecological one, right? And there's wonderful studies to show where there's high biodiversity, you get less zoonosis. And but everybody would like to make the vaccine and the tech, and next year, as this goes on and on, you'll get more and more pandemics. Nobody wants to look at the root cause. So my answer is yes, we should keep our forests, we should keep our biodiversity, not just as some, zoo that we go to, but for our very existence.
Yeah, sorry, I think the question was about an active role that we can take, in
Yeah, I mean, I think there are many groups who both within and outside academia, at least students in ecology, for example, are often active as activists, and write petitions, give sort of feedback when there are laws being passed. And I think this recent EIA stuff, there was a lot of student involvement in protesting it. Then there's street protests. But really, when you have the might of the government against you and you don't have government on your side, yes, there's no other way but to protest. But yeah, how many of them turn out to be successful? Yeah.
We got a couple of other questions.
Yes.
So one is about bats. So someone wants to know, do bats actually not use sonar to navigate?
I'm not very sure what prompted that question. Most bats must and do use sonar to navigate cluttered spaces, but some bats can fall silent for short periods of time. For example, Spasma does that when it's perching and it then wants to just home in on a prey. But to avoid obstacles, they have to use echolocation. Unless, like some of the big fruit bats, they may use vision as well. But it really, again, it depends upon the bat. Most bats will use echolocation. Occasionally, and we now have some nice evidence for this, bats who fly in pairs, one bat will sort of exploit the echolocation calls of another and fall silent for a while. But in general, most of the smaller bats, the non-fruit bats definitely, most of the time use echolocation.
Okay. And one last question. Someone wanted to know about, the kinds of clearance you need for like the kinds of ethical clearances you require to do cricket experiments also.
None. people don't really care about insects, and I mean, we do obtain them, but we don't really need the kinds of ethical clearances you need for vertebrate work. I don't know why, but as I said, many people don't even think of insects as animals. So we don't need too many clearances, though we do take them. Yeah.
Okay.
But for bats, yes, of course. And now it's going to get worse, right? With all the COVID recap.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you so much, Professor Rohini. This has been really interesting.
Yeah, it's been fun. I just wish I could have seen all the students. Talking to a screen is not so much as fun. But
yeah, definitely. And I hope that they've all had, a lot to absorb. I mean, I know they've had a lot to absorb, and I hope they will take these conversations further in their classes, or whether it's in school, colleges, anything.
Yeah.
And as always, please do keep track of when we are having these talks. We have a lot of exciting ones, and you can watch this one as well on YouTube later on. Please tell your friends. And I'd like to thank Professor Saudamani, who had initiated the series, and also the audience. And once again, Professor Rohini, thank you so much. And
thank you.
everybody have a great day. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.